The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
Good evening. I'm Chris Bury. Welcome to a special presentation of In the Loop, a look at the state of education in Chicago. The Chicago public school system is the third largest in the United States. The majority of students are minorities. And some studies show that the racial divide in Chicago schools hurts the quality of education, that far too often African American and Latino students are separate and unequal when it comes to opportunities for learning.
The schools, K through 12, white children and black in the same classroom.
It has been 60 years since the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that all children are entitled to an equal education under the law. But here in Chicago, studies show the educational advancements that many expected because of that landmark ruling have failed to materialize. Instead, for children in Chicago public schools, segregation along racial lines is still the norm. In fact, it's growing. Some parents, such as Omika Bolden, say Chicago's public schools discriminate against black and brown students by providing inferior resources in minority communities. Omika was so concerned she moved to the suburb of Evergreen Park. Now her daughter attends a public school where she gets the tools to succeed.
I have family members who are in CPS schools. I see the books that they bring home. I see some of the tools that they are given, to do their schoolwork with versus what my daughter is given here. My daughter has a laptop at her desk. No, I'm sorry, an iPad at her desk.
Omika believes that discrepancy in resources lingers from Chicago's historic pattern of racial segregation. And new research conducted for the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance found that segregated schools hurt the quality of education for minority students in Chicago public schools. The research shows students who attend schools in segregated, high-poverty neighborhoods are getting an education similar to those in developing nations.
The white population is about 9% in CPS, and then the minority population is more around 80–85%, with that being almost equal between Hispanics and African American students, but with slightly more Hispanic students. And what the data shows is that most black students are going to school with black students, most Hispanic students are going to school with Hispanic students, and most white students are going to school with white students.
The study also found racial integration becomes more difficult as students and parents get more choices among schools. Since 1996, Chicago has opened more than 130 charter schools. They are publicly financed but privately operated. The charter schools now educate one of nearly every 7 Chicago public school students. Brandon Johnson, Deputy Political Director for the Chicago Teachers Union, an opponent of charter schools, says they are not a better choice for public school students.
Charter schools are not offering the type of parental voice that's necessary. If you look at the boards that govern these charter schools, most of them do not reflect the population that they're servicing. The recent policy in Chicago right now has actually exacerbated the segregation that exists in the Chicago public schools, particularly with the proliferation of charter schools.
Catalyst Chicago, an independent education research group, found 30 of the 75 schools closed between 2000 and 2012 are now privately run under contract to the Chicago Public Schools. Troy LaRaviere, principal of Blaine Elementary School on the north side of Chicago, has strongly criticized the closing of neighborhood schools. He says the closings have allowed more charter schools to open and argues they don't have appropriate strategies to help minority children progress.
What students make up charter schools? And they're primarily black and brown students. Now, when you look at the achievement gap, who's on the low end of that achievement gap? Black and brown students. Or these are the students who need the most growth. but they're being funneled into a charter system that produces the least growth.
Academic results are mixed. An investigation by the Chicago Sun-Times and Northwestern University found little difference in the test scores of neighborhood and charter schools. In fact, elementary students at the neighborhood schools scored slightly higher overall on one standardized tests and scored more improvement in reading than the charter school students. But CPS magnet schools and others with selective admissions scored far better than either neighborhood or charter schools. Supporters of charter schools say they are more adaptive to the needs of their students than many traditional public schools.
The charter concept is rather simple. It's that a performance contract is granted to a group of educators to run a school, and in exchange for flexibility to the school on things like longer school day, curriculum choices, testing batteries, the school has to produce results. If the school doesn't produce results, it can be closed.
But the closing of so many Chicago public schools last year deeply concerns parents such as Jeanette Taylor, president of the local school council at Mollison Elementary. The Southside School welcomed 250 students from one of the 50 CPS schools closed last year. She says the school is overcrowded and must make do with very little.
We're making lemons into lemonade. We're not. It's really going to affect our after-school program.
Jitu Brown from the Kenwood and Oakland Community Organization filed a civil rights complaint on behalf of 2 Southside schools. He says CPS is neglecting the needs of minority communities in favor of more affluent neighborhoods.
While they're disinvesting in those basic quality of life services for us, they're investing in those services for other populations. So they're building selective enrollment schools on the north side. They're investing in commercial development.
But the roots of segregation in Chicago are deep. Experts say the problem reaches far beyond schools to questions of housing, jobs, and economic development in long neglected neighborhoods.
The housing segregation in Chicago and the school segregation are clearly linked, and that we need to invest more in communities that have faced the housing crisis, have faced foreclosures and vacancies, because that's affecting the school system.
A good school in your neighborhood is the foundation of everything. This is the only stable institution that we have in our communities. And so if you unstabilize the school, then what do our children have?
Now we're joined by 3 guests who have strong feelings on education. They are Miguel Del Valle, Commissioner for the Illinois Commerce Commission, Lorraine Forte, Editor-in-Chief, Catalyst Chicago, and Dwayne Turner, educator and CPS parent. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Welcome.
Miguel,
thanks.
Let's start with you. Aren't Chicago schools segregated simply because the neighborhoods here in Chicago are so racially divided?
Absolutely. It's not just racial segregation, it's economic segregation. It's housing segregation. These things are all tied. And so as long as we are not addressing all these areas, the school segregation is going to continue.
Well, we tried something years ago, Lorraine. We tried under federal or court order. We tried busing to desegregate Chicago schools. That was widely acknowledged to be a failure. So what's the answer now?
Well, as Miguel just said, the answer, well, and the problem really lies in housing patterns. Until we can develop communities to the level where people, you know, of all races want to live in them and come together and support their local school, their local business, their, you know, local church or whatever, it's going to continue to be a problem. I did not grow up in Chicago. I grew up mostly in Ohio, and in the district where I went, I rode the bus. It was a voluntary busing agreement in that community, and I rode the bus to a school in a little higher economic community and got a good education. But, you know, sometimes those things don't work, and apparently it didn't work in Chicago because the city just has such a long history of racial tension and divisiveness.
Dwayne, we heard a parent in the opening report there talk about the different resources that her child now has an iPad. Is it that simple? Is it really just a matter of resources that separates the races in the schools?
Well, I think it's a big part of it, but also I think it has something to do with you can't talk about schools without talking about all of these issues, such as housing, such as economic development in the neighborhood. So all of those things go into creating, you know, stable communities and stable schools. But also, I think it's the approach that you have to the curriculum. And so, you know, with this issue about public education, I think what parents are looking for is they're looking for innovation, they're looking for a quality education, and they're looking for safety. And so it's very difficult to have those things if you have a system that is pulling resources out of one particular school system or one particular part of town and giving it to another.
This all ties into the ever-raging debate over charter schools. And Miguel, the Chicago Teachers Union has called for a moratorium on new charter schools. Are they right?
I think they're right to bring up the issue and shed light on the issue that we're developing a dual system of public education in the state of Illinois and in the city of Chicago, and that we are doing it at the expense of neighborhood schools. Neighborhood schools that are the anchor. I think the parent in the introductory piece said it well. You destroy an anchor, then you're further destabilizing a community. And that's what's happened time and time again in the city of Chicago. Charter schools were originally presented as an opportunity to have laboratories where people could experiment and share best practices with other schools.
Where's the evidence, though? I mean, you've done some work on this, right?
Yeah.
Is there a significant improvement?
No, and the Sun-Times did that report, and there's been other research, people at universities, and none of it shows that charters in and of themselves as a group are any better. At most, you would say that they're equal, but the idea of and how charters have evolved kind of actually works against the idea of creating, you know, a stable neighborhood and community, because you could open a charter, you know, right across the street, but your child still has to enter a lottery to get into that school. So it doesn't function as, you know, a neighborhood institution really at all. And CPS is open them saying, well, parents want choice, choice, choice. And
well, there's a parent sitting right next to you.
Right, there's a parent right next to you.
Let's hear from the parent here.
Yeah, and I definitely want to jump in on this because, you know, the charter school movement, they always talk about, well, we're public schools too. But I think in terms of their connection to the community, number one, there isn't the accountability that neighborhood public schools have in terms of they do not have an elected school board. So there's less democratic participation. I think the other piece of that is that they do not have to open up, they're privately managed, and so they do not have to open up their finances to say, you know, what are we spending on this and how are we spending it, so on and so forth. So I think that the neighborhood schools presents a better model in terms of being tethered to the community, to be an anchor to the community and being a stable, you know, organization that.
But as a parent, you heard the argument from the charter school proponent there that they have more flexibility to run the school as they see fit. And what I think he was saying is they're not so encumbered by a big bureaucracy downtown.
Well, you know, and I said previously that parents do want innovation, they do want choice, but I think it's a false choice to say that charter schools provide that because, number one, they're not providing the innovation. They're actually resegregating the student population because they're able to cherry pick students. And, you know, I think the important thing to remember is that neighborhood schools there's nothing about a neighborhood school that can't innovate. You know, there are options for parents in terms of, you know, having to be able to go to innovative schools in their own neighborhood.
You had something to say here.
Well, what I was going to say actually touched on the finances. And several years ago, we did a report on, you know, charters and teacher turnover and finances. And a lot of them at the time, you know, from the data we were able to get, they're operating with financial deficit. And a lot of them are very heavily dependent on private money. And how long are people going to give that private money? What happens when, you know, wealthy people say, okay, well, I'm tired of this, I'm going on to the next thing. So you're creating a system that's partly publicly funded, but is, if say it's a good charter school, but it's still heavily dependent on private money. And that's kind of a recipe for not working.
Miguel, you want to jump in?
But charters originally stated that they could do more with less. Today, they're demanding an equal amount of per pupil funding. And so the ball game has changed.
You're saying the whole rationale is...
The ball game has changed. And so they're doing this at the expense of neighborhood schools because that money is coming right out of the CPS budget. And so while we're cutting budgets in neighborhood schools, we're expanding the number of charters. While we're closing neighborhood schools, we're expanding a number of charters. This is filled with contradictions, and people see that. But people do want options. They want options within the system, no doubt about it. Parents want a safe environment for their children. They want a quality education. They're willing to put their kids on a bus anywhere as long as they're getting those things.
Let's address that first point. For many students, just getting to school safely is a real concern. In 2009, CPS created the Safe Passage program designed to make the walk to and from school more secure. Recently, Governor Quinn approved millions of more dollars to expand the program. Let's hear what Mayor Emanuel had to say.
But with the governor's help, I talked to him a couple of weeks ago. He saw the success of what you did last year. Attendance was up, safety was improved, and he's provided the city of Chicago an additional $10 million to expand safe spaces.
Well, another $10 million, and it looks like we're going to have about 2,000 employees working for Safe Passage. Dwayne, is this a good use of taxpayer money to keep this kind of program up year after year at those numbers, $10 million?
Well, I'm never going to argue that having an extra set of eyes or, people on the street as students go to and from school is a bad thing. But I think it's a Band-Aid that's masking the real problem. And I think the real problem is that when you are shuttering, since 2001, over 100 schools have been closed, you create blight. And so there's a disinvestment that's occurring in the community on many different levels. And so I think that the money that they're spending on Safe Passage really should be put back into the schools, really should be put back into the communities. And so you don't have this need to have, all of these people throughout the community that are, protecting students against abandoned housing, places where they may be doing, illegal activity and those sorts of things. So there's a lack of investment in the communities, and that's really where the money needs to be going, not towards a Band-Aid solution.
Lorraine, it looks as if this has been a success. I mean, it's relatively new, but there have been no major incidents along these routes.
And I as Dwayne said, it's hard to argue against, hiring people to be out and about to keep kids safe. But, when you close schools and create, as he said, another abandoned building in the neighborhood, it's a recipe for more crime down the road, even petty vandalism or what have you. But, long term, the solution does have to be something other than, okay, we're going to hire some people to monitor the street in the morning and in the afternoon, because how do you keep that up over the long term? It's $10 million for 1 year.
That's exactly the question. How do you sustain that? I mean, 2,000 employees, $10 million.
Good question. And first of all, I want to say this is not new. We had parent safety patrols in our schools. Most of them were volunteers.
But I mean, the Safe Passage that's funded by the government is new,
yes,
right?
and most of them were volunteers. And I want to get at your point here. And the reason why that was not sustained was because they didn't have the resources to buy the jackets and get the radios and the equipment that the volunteers needed. Right. In order for there to be an effective program for ensuring student safety in and around schools, you need to sustain it with resources. And so if the governor puts up 10 million, and if that's duplicated in the future, then we can maintain that program. It is necessary.
It is necessary over the long haul to keep up funding at those kinds of levels.
But we were doing it before, and we let it go by the wayside.
Mm-hmm. Once the kids get to school safely, and so far Safe Passage looks like it is working, then discipline is what may keep them in school. And a couple of years ago, the school system here decided to ease up a little bit and move away from a zero tolerance policy. And Dwayne, as a parent, have you seen the change in the Chicago Public Schools? And if so, how's it going?
Well, I do think that zero tolerance doesn't work because pushing students out of school and onto the street and suspending them ultimately impacts the community as well as the child. So I think it's a good move to have to try to have policies in place to keep students in the classroom, in the school. But I think what's missing from that equation is the fact that they're not providing, like CPS does not have enough school counselors. They do not have enough nurses, and so these counselors and nurses, they're running from school to school. They're trying to serve a population that has many different issues and many different needs. And so along with having, a policy where we're going to not suspend as many students and we're going to try to use restorative justice, the students need the wraparound supports, the schools need the wraparound supports so that those students can be successful, that learning can take place in the classroom, and the school functions in a proper climate.
Lorraine, what do the numbers say?
Well, actually, the numbers show that suspensions overall are down, but we took a closer look at them, and actually they're down in high schools, but they're actually up somewhat in elementary schools. And you don't want to put small children out of school any more than you want to put older kids out of school. But the district has really made it clear, we need to bring suspensions down. I mean, Barbara Berg-Bennett has looked at the numbers and she said this is a problem. We don't want to put kids out of school. And so far it's working on one end, but then again at the earlier grades, suspensions are up. But there was never a lot of money at all put into, training teachers and bringing in counselors, or how do you deal with kids.
Jump in here for your quick point.
Aren't they down in high school because we're putting more kids in alternative programs?
Well, and actually that is a factor. I mean, the district has said we're going to open more alternative high schools, and so that could be part of the reason.
Finally, we have some homework here, but we don't have to do it. We just have to talk about it. Some CPS schools are implementing a no homework policy. It allows individual principals to decide whether students should get homework. The decision seems to be more popular among students than parents, no surprise.
Kids need to learn how to form good study habits, and homework is the way that they form these study habits.
I really don't agree with that. I really don't think that's a good idea, because the early stages of learning are generally when they take in the most and when they're most impressionable. So I think that would be a good time, if any, to have the homework around.
We go to school for 7 hours and we got homework for like 3 hours or something, and like wasting our whole day. We should have like a little freedom.
I don't like about homework is when I have to stay up all night.
We just have a little bit of time here. What's your thought on this?
Well,
this is for the little guys, though. This is the elementary school.
Okay, and so I guess the no homework policy, a lot depends on the family. There's a variety of factors there. But I'm an old school. I have three children. I do think students in general should have homework. I guess it depends on the type of homework that they're getting. Students should have the opportunity to read for fun. But for a lot of the children in Chicago, we have 1 out of 4 children living in poverty. And so if you've been in the homes like I have, you notice that they do not have libraries at home. And so there has to be an investment of resources. If they do not have libraries at home, that the school provides books that the students can take home and understand that some of those books may not come back.
Miguel, but what about for the first and second graders and the kindergartners that this really applies to?
Well, I think there has to be some homework, but that homework has to be done with the parent. And I think at those early grades, it's a wonderful time for parents and children to really develop that close relationship and that trusting relationship that allows them to be as parents of assistance in the later years when it gets tougher.
All right, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time of our guests, Miguel DeValle, Lorraine Forte, and Dwayne Turner.